A captain who hasn't lost a single fight in 622 days at sea is, this morning, unarmed. His magazines are locked shut, his seaplane is stripped down for maintenance, and alongside his hull, connected by fuel hoses, sits a submarine he himself is refueling. The 22nd of November, 1941, South Atlantic, 350 miles northwest of Ascension Island. The German raider Atlantis, under the flag of Kapitan zur See Bernhard Rogge, the most successful raider of the entire war. 22 ships sunk or captured, nearly 145,000 tons of Allied cargo. 3 days earlier, a disguised ship exactly like this one lured in and sank the Australian cruiser Sydney with her entire crew. 645 men died. Not one survived. Rogge is certain the disguise will work today, because it has worked every single time before.
What he doesn't know is this. British intelligence has already read his own signal about the submarine rendezvous and sent a cruiser to this exact patch of ocean. The calculation was wrong, and the cost of that mistake will become clear within 3 hours. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why a British cruiser won this fight without doing anything brave at all. Why identifying the most elusive ship of the war came down to a single wrong letter in a distress code. And why the captain whose reputation saved him from an Allied war crimes trial spent the rest of his life calling this the bitterest day of it. Before we go further, one question for you personally. If you were commanding this cruiser and couldn't be certain who you were looking at, would you close the distance to be sure, or hold back at a safe range and risk being wrong? Write in the comments what you'd choose, and if someone in your family went to sea in that war, tell us about them, too.
Now let's go back to where this all began, to a ship that wasn't really a ship at all. To understand what happened that morning, you first have to understand what the Royal Navy had been dealing with for the previous 2 years. German raiders didn't look like warships. Each one started life as an ordinary cargo liner, then went into a shipyard and came out with guns hidden behind hinged steel plates in the hull, torpedo tubes cut into the hull below the waterline, and a paint shop capable of rewriting the ship's entire silhouette overnight. A ship like this could pass within 100 miles of a convoy and raise no alarm at all. It looked like everyone's harmless neighbor, right up until the plates dropped and the first salvo left the barrels. Atlantis was deadlier than all the rest.
Under Rogge's command, she ranged from the Atlantic to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, taking 22 ships and close to 145,000 tons of Allied cargo, more than any other raider of the war. Behind her hinged plates waited 6 5.9-inch guns, 2 smaller guns, and 4 torpedo tubes at the waterline. Her rangefinder hid inside a water tank above the wheelhouse. Collapsible ventilators, removable posts, telescoping masts, and a second dummy funnel let the ship change her appearance again and again. By her builder's own records, Atlantis could take on 26 different silhouettes. Rogge used every one of them. False flags, repainted hulls, a fake second funnel, a new name painted on the bow at every new encounter. 9 such raiders put to sea over the course of the war. Between them, they sank or captured around 140 ships, close to 900,000 tons of Allied cargo, and spent more than 10 years of combined ship time at sea. Atlantis was the best of the 9, not the fastest, not the most heavily armed, just the one that fooled an entire ocean longer and more effectively than any of the others. Atlantis had one more tool besides her guns and torpedoes. Hidden in her hold was a mine compartment holding 92 contact mines. In May of 1941, the raider laid this entire minefield off Cape Agulhas at the southern tip of Africa, 30 miles from the lighthouse, laid in a pattern meant to look like the work of a submarine rather than a surface ship. German propaganda later boasted over the radio that a minefield sown by a German raider had sent 8 merchant ships to the bottom. That wasn't true. One of the mines broke loose and washed ashore, the British were warned. Shipping was rerouted around the field, and not a single ship was lost to it. Even Atlantis's successes weren't always what they were made out to be. But for 2 years straight, the world believed them anyway.
The danger of 9 ships like this wasn't measured only in sunk tonnage. The mere threat of their existence forced Britain to herd merchant ships into slow, unwieldy convoys, spread aircraft and escort ships across every ocean at once, and kept the Admiralty in a constant state of tension, never able to know in advance where on the map the next disguised hunter would surface. A handful of dressed-up cargo ships held entire supply routes stretching across tens of thousands of miles under threat, and did it almost without ever engaging a warship in open battle. A ship like this was almost impossible to catch by sight. It could only be caught by knowledge. There's one story that says more about Rogie than any list of sunk ships, and it happened 7 months before that morning. In April of 1941, Atlantis mistook the Egyptian passenger liner Zamzam for a troop transport and opened fire on her.
Aboard were around 200 passengers, most of them American Protestant missionaries, including women and children, along with 24 volunteer ambulance drivers headed to join the British Army in the Middle East. Zamzam's captain frantically flashed a light, signaling that there were civilians aboard. Rogie ceased fire, but it was already too late. The liner was sinking. The Germans pulled every single person out of the water. The United States hadn't entered the war yet, and a neutral passenger ship with American civilians aboard could easily have been the spark that turned public opinion toward war. Germany's propaganda ministry immediately announced that every passenger had been rescued by the German warship Atlantis, under the command of a devout Lutheran. That was the plain truth, and it's exactly why the story never became a second Lusitania.
That's who the man was, whose disguise was about to be tested that November morning. A captain whose one mistake nearly dragged America into the war 6 months early, and whose personal decency on that same day undid the mistake. By December of 1940, less than a year into the voyage, Rogie received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. In December of 41, he received the oak leaves to go with it. He was presented with a ceremonial Japanese samurai sword. Not one prisoner died during the entire cruise of Atlantis. The captain of the merchant ship City of Baghdad, sunk by the raider in July of 41, later said that Rogie's treatment of prisoners left behind respect, not hatred. Standing against the British that morning was a master of his trade, a man who had outplayed an entire navy at the same game for 2 years straight and never once lost.
22 ships in 622 days means Rogie ran this exact game roughly once a month, over and over, each time with a new flag and a new name, each time flawlessly, right up to that very last morning. His own crew lost fewer men in combat across the whole cruise than most battles lose in a single day. Atlantis carried a crew of 349, and every one of them trusted their captain the way people only trust someone who has never once let them down. The Royal Navy, meanwhile, was paying a terrible price for this same game, not only in cargo lost to the bottom, but in the men who tried to catch these raiders up close. On the 19th of November, 1941, just 3 days before that morning off Ascension Island, the Australian light cruiser Sydney approached a ship off the west coast of Australia that claimed to be a Dutch trader. It was the disguised German raider Cormoran. Sydney closed to under 1,000 yards to be certain. At that range, the disguise fell apart. Both ships opened fire at the same moment, and both were destroyed. Of Sydney's 645 crew, not one survived. The Germans lost 80 men, but 317 survived and were taken prisoner. The only witnesses to that battle were the captured Germans, because there was no one left to tell the British side of the story. Sydney's own wreck lay unidentified on the seabed until 2008, and for almost 7 decades, the entire account rested on the enemy's word alone. That was the price of closing the distance. And the whole Royal Navy now knew it, exactly 3 days before the next encounter with the very same trick. This cruiser had exactly one chance not to repeat Sydney's fate, and that entire chance had been drawn into her blueprints long before anyone aboard her had ever heard the name Atlantis. The ship that would meet the raider that morning, Devonshire, had been built to a design the fleet argued over for the better part of a decade. To stay within international treaty weight limits, her designers gave the cruiser a powerful gun battery and almost no armor at all. A deck belt barely an inch thick over the machinery spaces. Critics called ships like her a hull full of hammers with no shield, a cruiser that couldn't afford to take a single hit. In a close fight against a skilled opponent, they had every reason to worry. But Devonshire was never built for a close fight. Her strength was reach. 8 8-inch guns sat in 4 twin turrets, and she carried something no raider could match: a seaplane on a catapult amidships. That aircraft was her eyes. It could find a target over the horizon long before any lookout raised a mast, and hang over an enemy, correcting the fall of shot. A cruiser of this class could see first, shoot first, and fire from a range her answer could never reach in return. She displaced 9,850 tons. Her speed topped 32 knots, faster than any raider afloat, which meant the cruiser, not the enemy, chose the range of any fight. Her crew numbered 784 officers and men. In command that November was Captain Robert Oliver, a careful, methodical officer with no taste at all for an unnecessary brawl. Devonshire hadn't stumbled onto the raider by accident. British codebreakers at Hut 8, Bletchley Park, had broken the German naval cipher and read Atlantis's own orders. On her way home after a long cruise, the ship was to refuel the submarine U-126 at a specific square of the South Atlantic. Devonshire was sent to that exact square on a general sweep for raiders and supply ships in the area. The cruiser arrived in these waters knowing something was here.
She didn't yet know it was the most wanted ship in the southern hemisphere. Rogie himself knew nothing about this leak. To him, radio silence remained just as reliable a shield as a repainted hull and a foreign flag. If a message wasn't intercepted by voice over open air, then surely no one had heard it. The entire work of Hut 8 depended on exactly that belief. While German captains trusted that an encrypted order meant total silence, every one of those orders was being read in London almost in real time, and the enemy never once suspected it, for the whole war. A raider that had spent 2 years deceiving the world by repainting her own hull was, in turn, deceived by a code she trusted without question. Dawn on the 22nd broke gray and flat, with a long, low swell and haze on the horizon. Before full light, Devonshire flew off her seaplane for the usual morning search, the same one flown every single morning. The aircraft climbed away, became a speck, then vanished.
A little further south, on the same water, the raider lay stopped and helpless, in a way she had never been in over 600 days of war. Rogie had brought his ship to a halt to refuel the submarine U-126, which lay alongside with hoses run across to the raider's fuel tanks. The submarine's own captain had come aboard Atlantis for breakfast and a bath. Fuel drums stood on the deck. The raider's own seaplane was stripped down for maintenance. Her 6 guns sat behind lowered plates. For the first time in her long career, the most dangerous merchant ship on the ocean could neither run nor fight at the exact moment it would matter. Refueling a submarine at sea was a routine, well-practiced operation, one Atlantis's crew had carried out before, supplying not only herself but other raiders and Kriegsmarine submarines that had strayed too far from their own bases.
It was precisely this role as a floating filling station for the entire German war fleet at sea that made Atlantis such a valuable target for British intelligence. And it was that same role that, on this one morning, cost the raider her mobility for a few decisive minutes. Over 600 days of raiding had made her captain careful, and this halt was the exact thing he hated most. A raider tied to a submarine by a fuel hose, unable to get underway. He'd planned to be gone by full daylight. He was minutes too slow. Aboard the raider that morning, there was a strange unease. The ship's adjutant had woken from a recurring dream. A 3-funneled British cruiser emerging from the haze straight at them. He shook it off. The sea was empty.
The refueling continued, drum by drum, hose by hose, both crews working in silence. Then a lookout at the masthead spotted a speck in the sky. Just after 7, the seaplane's signal reached the cruiser, a stopped merchant ship roughly 40 miles off. Devonshire turned onto that bearing and worked up speed, and shortly after 8, her lookouts made out foreign masts over the horizon. Aboard the raider, the reaction was instant and desperate. The masthead cry of an enemy cruiser sighted ran through the whole ship. Alongside Rogie sat a submarine with her tanks half full. A warship was closing, and there was no time for a fight. He gave the only order he could. The submarine cast off and crash-dived to save herself. The submarine's own captain, at that exact moment, was sitting down to breakfast aboard Atlantis, having just taken a bath, something a submarine at sea could never have offered him. His boat went under without him, leaving her commander stranded on the raider's deck among someone else's crew, forced to watch a battle he could neither command nor influence in any way. Atlantis put her helm over, wrung every knot her diesels could give, and turned away to run, trailing smoke to hide her hull. The raider captain's choice was simple and hopeless. His guns couldn't reach the cruiser.
His torpedoes needed the enemy to come closer, and she showed no sign of doing that. His aircraft lay stripped down on the deck. His submarine had saved herself and left him alone on the surface against a warship. All that remained was to buy time with a lie and hope the range held long enough for the boat below to get into position. The cruiser didn't close into range of the raider's own guns. She flew off her second aircraft and held back. At about 8:30, she fired 2 ranging salvos at the fleeing ship, one short, one over. A hard question, asked in steel: answer or be answered. The raider answered with a lie. She stopped, and her radio began broadcasting the voice of an innocent merchantman under attack. She named herself Polyphemus, a Dutch cargo ship, gave a position, and called the world for help. It was a good lie. It had worked before. This was the exact minute the whole engagement turned, and every bit of the danger now sat on the British side. If the stranger really was a Dutch freighter, opening fire would be murder. If she was the raider, closing in to check meant entering the range of 6 hidden guns and 4 torpedo tubes, the very trap that had swallowed Sydney whole 3 days earlier. And somewhere, under that flat gray water, a submarine was already working into position for a torpedo shot at the cruiser. The temptation to close in was real. A boarding party could settle the question in 20 minutes, and the whole business could be wrapped up by lunch. But it was exactly 20 minutes inside torpedo range that had killed 600 men 3 days before. And Oliver had read that same signal, too. He held the cruiser off at a good 10 nautical miles, put her onto an unpredictable weaving course so no submarine could settle a firing solution, kept his speed up, and set about proving what the ship actually was without ever coming close enough to be killed by the answer.
A recognition book like this wasn't the invention of any one ship, and it wasn't some secret file locked away for a select few. It was a standard volume that sat on the chart table of every Allied cruiser, into which every new encounter with a raider added a new alias, a new silhouette, a new scrap of a photograph, gathered by chance or smuggled out at cost. Atlantis's 26th disguise, under the name Temesis, had been entered into that book by someone in naval intelligence months before this morning, with no way of knowing whether that page would ever matter to anyone at all. It mattered to Devonshire. Oliver signaled his base at Freetown, where the real Polyphemus actually was. He asked the aircraft circling above the stranger to describe the shape of her stern. The pilot, looking down, reported that it matched a ship called Temesis, that same alias from the recognition book, right beside a smuggled photograph of Atlantis herself. The evidence was building. Certainty still wasn't there. Oliver waited, still weaving his course, still holding the range. There was one more test, and the raider failed it on her own. Sending her distress call, Atlantis transmitted the alarm any genuine merchant ship would send under attack by a surface raider. A signal of 3 letters, R, sent in a row. But the code had since been changed. The correct signal was now 4 letters, R in a row. The Germans, cut off from contact with home for over 600 days, simply didn't know. 3 letters where there should have been 4, a tiny wrongness, but it told the listening British everything. The sender wasn't who she claimed to be. Now time stopped. Oliver had the aircraft's identification, a false name matched in the recognition book, and a wrong distress code. And somewhere beneath him, a submarine still waited. He had 2 paths open.
Close in, board her, and be certain. The brave and correct by the book path, the one every instinct of the service demanded, the one Sydney had taken. Or stay 10 miles off, accept the evidence as proof, and destroy the ship by gunfire from a range she couldn't reach. He waited for one last word. From Freetown came the answer over the wire. 3 words. No. Repeat, no. She was not Polyphemus. The question was closed. At about 9:30, the cruiser opened fire in earnest, and now the reach she had been built for did the entire job by itself. Her 8-inch guns threw a 256-pound shell out to about 17,000 yards. The Raiders' 5-inch guns, had she dared unmask them, threw barely 100 pounds and couldn't have reached the cruiser at all. This was an execution at a range her victim couldn't answer, not any kind of fair fight. There's a cold arithmetic in that. A ship that can hit where the enemy can't hit back doesn't need armor, doesn't need rate of fire, doesn't need luck. It only needs to hold the range and keep firing. Devonshire had the guns, the speed, and the eyes to do exactly that. She never needed anything more. The Raiders' 6 guns, the same ones that had hidden behind steel plates for 2 years straight, never once opened up during this entire fight. Unmasking them would have meant confirming her own identity with a broadside at the exact moment doubt had already run out, and exposing herself to return fire she couldn't survive. The weapon Atlantis's entire deception had been built around sat locked behind the same plates that had hidden her from view 22 times before, right through her very last battle. Aboard the Raider, Rogie watched the 3 funnels of the British cruiser through his glasses, the very same shape from his adjutant's dream, and understood in that instant there would be no fight and no escape either. Unmasking his guns meant taking a broadside he wouldn't survive and couldn't answer. He did the only thing left to a captain who had run out of sea room. He prepared to scuttle his own ship and save his men. Throughout the fight, Devonshire's seaplane held over the raider, radioing back where every salvo landed and correcting the next one. The gun crews on the cruiser never saw a living enemy, only correction figures coming down from above and a cloud of distant smoke on the horizon. This was ordinary artillery work at a range that, by its very nature, let nothing human show through from the other end of the distance. The cruiser found the range fast. The first salvo fell close. The second and third hit home. Fires took hold along the raider's length. She held her course, trailed smoke, and never fired back, because firing back was pointless. Devonshire kept up a steady, unhurried rhythm, salvo after salvo, more than 24 in all, correcting each time off the report from the aircraft overhead. The cruiser never sat still for a second, never once held a straight course, weaving constantly, always out of reach. Aboard the raider, men fought fires knowing there was nothing to answer with, and kept fighting them again and again, because the alternative was simply standing there waiting for the next hit. No one could fire back, no one could outrun a shell, and the only work left to Atlantis's crew in her final hour was fighting for their own ship with bare hands, buckets and hoses, against an enemy they couldn't even properly make out through the smoke on the horizon. At just before 10, the fire reached the powder magazine. The bow tore apart in one sharp flash, and smoke stood up over the water like a column.
Rogie had already given the order. The crew took to the boats and rafts, and as their ship went under, some of them stood up and gave 3 cheers for Atlantis. At about 16 minutes past 10, her shattered bow rose, and she slid stern first into the South Atlantic. If this deep dive is worth your time, hit like and subscribe. Coming up, why Devonshire didn't stop to save the survivors, even though she could have. What happened to the supply ship that carried the rescued Germans home? And Rogie's own words about that day, spoken after the war. Devonshire never closed in to pick up the survivors, and Oliver has been second-guessed for it ever since. But the reason was the same one that had won him the fight. A submarine was still out there, somewhere under the water. The cruiser's own aircraft, recovered shortly after the babble, confirmed it.
Stopping in that water and lowering boats would have handed a torpedo a stationary target, and Oliver was no more willing to do that now than he had been an hour earlier. Devonshire recovered her aircraft, turned away, and left the rescue to the one vessel it actually belonged to, the enemy's own submarine. The argument over whether that was the right call hasn't quieted down even decades later. To many within the Navy itself, leaving hundreds of men in the water, even enemy men, felt like almost as serious a breach of the sea's unwritten rules as firing on what might have been an innocent ship. But that rule was written for ordinary warfare, not for war against a raider whose very last act could leave a trap waiting under the water for her rescuer. Oliver made the call that sounds cold, retold after the fact, and was the only correct one on the spot. 7 Germans died aboard the raider. The cruiser didn't take a scratch.
Not one shell ever reached her, because not one gun aboard the raider could throw that far. That single inch of armor, her critics had mourned, was never once called on to stop anything at all. Germany's most successful raider of the entire war was destroyed, and with her died the last real hope of the surface raider campaign in the southern oceans. What followed proved the point more eloquently than any report could. The submarine U-126 surfaced, took hundreds of survivors aboard and onto rafts, and set out across the ocean to rendezvous with the supply ship Python. 9 days later, on the 1st of December, Python herself was found and sunk south of St. Helena by Devonshire's own sister ship, the cruiser Dorsetshire. 3 more German submarines joined the rescue of both crews, and then, between the 14th and 18th of December, 4 Italian submarines picked up part of Atlantis's crew off the Cape Verde Islands and carried them to Saint-Nazaire in France. Of the whole cruise, only 7 men died aboard the raider herself, and not 1 aboard Python. Of the 9 German surface raiders that put to sea over the course of the war, Atlantis's loss marked the turning point for the entire program. By the end of 1942, almost all the rest had been sunk, interned, or recalled home. The experience that had made Atlantis untouchable for 2 years running turned out to be worth nothing the moment a captain on the other end of the range simply refused to play by her rules. It was a remarkable rescue, and at the same time, a quiet admission. The raider herself was finished, and the ocean she had terrorized for 2 years was closing to her trade for good. Set these 2 cruisers side by side, 3 days apart, against the exact same trick. Sydney trusted her own courage, closed to under 1,000 yards to be certain, and died with her entire crew. Devonshire trusted her guns and her own judgment, stayed 10 miles off, and destroyed a far more dangerous enemy without losing a single man or taking a single hit. The same disguise, the same hidden guns, the opposite method, the opposite result. The Admiralty drew the obvious lesson from it and wrote it into standing orders. A suspicious ship was to be stopped and identified from a range beyond her own reach, under threat of fire, and never again taken on trust up close. Devonshire herself survived the war intact. After Germany's surrender, she ferried British troops home from Australia, and from 1947 onward served as a training ship for naval cadets. She wasn't sent for scrap until 1954, quietly, without a single battle scar, for all the years she carried that 1 inch of deck armor across the ocean. Rogie, a captain even his own former prisoners remembered with respect, put the German reckoning of that day more honestly than anyone. His bitterness, he wrote afterward, was sharpest at the thought that they'd been forced to abandon their ship without firing a single shot in return. That, in the end, was the whole British achievement. The cruiser won by never once giving the enemy the fight he needed. Go back in your mind to that flat gray morning, and the ship stopped in the middle of an empty sea, a submarine alongside and hoses running across her deck, flying a flag that wasn't hers and carrying a name that was a lie. The raiders' entire war had been built on disguise, surprise, and closing the range. She had lived by getting close before anyone understood who she was. She was killed by a cruiser that simply refused to get close at all. Devonshire did nothing dashing that morning. She found the enemy first with an aircraft, established the truth through patient signaling and a recognition book, kept clear of a submarine she couldn't see, and destroyed the most successful raider of the war from a range that raider could never answer. It was not a brave victory. It was a correct one. And on that particular war, the second turned out to be a far rarer quality than the first. Rogie survived the war. His reputation, that same devout Lutheran who had saved every last soul off Zamzam, a captain his former prisoners remembered with respect, turned out to be one of the few reasons the Allies never put a German admiral on trial. In 1957, he returned to service, now in the West German Navy, as a rear admiral, and commanded a military district for nearly 5 years. He died in 1982, at the age of 82, more than 40 years after the morning his flawless disguise met an enemy who simply refused to believe it, up close. 2 captains, 3 days, and the exact same lie taught the exact same Navy 2 completely different lessons. One lesson cost 645 lives. The other cost almost nothing at all, beyond patience, and 10 miles of open water between a ship and something it would have been far too easy to believe. If this story was worth your time, subscribe. One video like it every few weeks, long form, no filler.